morning. My name is Richard Wexler, and this is episode 5 of our podcast entitled Elder Ed, Understanding the Complexities of Aging and Care. And this morning we'll be having a conversation with Luke Daniels. But first, a quick update. About 18 years ago, my wife and I and our 2 small children began caring for all 4 of our parents, an unbelievable journey that lasted 14 years. That led us to our company, Points of Life, led us to a lot of education, educating thousands of people, and the want to start this podcast to educate even more. So before we bring Luke on, a little bit about his background. Since 2004, he has been involved in caring for and advising seniors. His knowledge and passion are in planning and coordinating care and in aiding the choice of the right living situation that will suit everyone. He is actively involved in the senior support community and provides leadership and advocacy for aging in place. His experience has guided folks to find the best situation.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you, sir?
I'm doing very well. It's good to hear your voice again.
Good. In Charleston, South Carolina, if I recall. Is that correct?
That is correct, and it is gorgeous and spring-like here.
And if I also recall, you're pretty close to the water.
I can see it from my window. That is correct.
I am jealous. So let me ask you a question. How did you get started, and why did you get started in caring for seniors?
I got started caring for my own parents. It started in 2004 when my mother was diagnosed with multiple myeloma.
Wow.
And I was living in North Carolina at the time. So I came down here to manage that and ended up hiring someone like myself. But back then, I found a semi-retired senior care advisor, basically a geriatric care manager. And she was a former nurse, so that was a perfect person to hire while I was out of town. And a few years later, my father was diagnosed with an aggressive form of lymphoma.
Wow.
And his wife was not taking care of him. So I came down and took care of him. And
so your story sounds similar to my story, and it sounds similar to so many people I work with, and I know I'm putting words in your mouth, but maybe similar to people you work with that are actually in the senior care industry that get into it because they have a personal experience like you did, like I did.
That is correct.
So one of the words that we work around a lot, and I think it's a word that you work around a lot as well, is planning. And
Oh, yes.
One of the things that I find is, if you want to correct me, go ahead. But in my experience, in the 18 years I've been doing this, I will say most, and most is a huge number, have not done any planning, whether that is the older loved ones in the family, the older loved ones with the adult children, etc. Would you agree with that?
100%. 100%. It's remarkable when I run into someone who has.
So why do people, I hear a million excuses, and you may hear the same, not going to happen in my family, and if it happens, it won't be that difficult, and we'll just take care of it. And most of the clients I've worked with over the years, and it may be similar for you, they're in crisis mode. Why do you think people delay?
Richard, it's human nature. It's an intangible event that may or may not happen in the future, but I'm busy with getting my 14-year-old to practice, my 8-year-old to school, and busy with life.
Yep.
And that is an intangible that's way off in the distance.
You think part of it too, since this family, the adult children, the older loved one or loved ones have not been there. So they really don't understand what being there is all about. What you understand it, I understand it. And when they look at me, maybe look at you and go, it's not going to be that difficult. The word that I use, it's not going to be that complex. We'll just deal with it. Do you
So
think that's part of it?
if they give it that much thought, yes. I have a suspicion that a lot of people don't want to look there. And until someone near to them, either somebody they know well or in the family, happens, that crisis occurs and all hands on deck, the children are flying in, then a neighbor, a friend hears about it and says, maybe I ought to do something here. So sometimes the children will motivate the parents.
I agree with you. I mean, your verbiage sounds a lot like mine, where mom's flat on her back, dad's flat on her back, they're in the hospital. Maybe they've always been strong as an ox. They had never been in that situation before. The phone calls go out, the texts go out, and the kids start flying in, freaking out about what's going to happen with mom, dad, grandparents, whomever it may be. Do you see that a lot?
I see that. I just had a call this morning, and a client who's in the hospital. She lives alone. The hospital is trying to get her oxygen levels correct, so she's going into rehab. The son was supposed to fly in today. Well, his wife's sister died,
Wow.
so he's down in Florida,
Wow.
so he's not coming for another week. And meantime, later today. I'm meeting a biohazard professional cleanup to go into her home and clean up the house and get it ready for the son.
Wow. I mean, I think you used the phrase that, life happens. And this is obviously an example of life happening. And we talk about, okay, maybe you're not going to do anything till mom's flat on her back. I get it. But then life happens and everything. I know you use the word challenging, I use the word complex. They're pretty much the same thing. That stuff, and I use stuff a lot, stuff happens in life. So these plans that you really didn't have, and now you're trying to put together at a very difficult time, you run into all these walls.
Absolutely.
In your practice, let me ask you a question. I mean, why should someone hire, you're considered a senior care advisor. Why should someone hire someone like you?
There are a number of reasons depending upon what stage you're in, and we've just touched on the crisis stage. And those are the most frequent calls I get when people are in crisis. But the best time is to meet well before crisis occurs to help pull your information and form a plan. So that's the best way to use my services. So let's talk, let's get together, let's see what our finances are, what our medical situation is, what our insurance information is, and especially since it's become the most complicated part in the last 10 years, is all the electronic, the information that's in the cloud now. Let's get all that together so that when the crisis happens, no one is scrambling and we know everything that's going to happen. Get your plan together. That's what it is. Just make a plan.
A previous guest was talking about something similar, and I think it's along the same lines that you're talking. There's, like in my family, my wife was the hands-on caregiver. I was the guy in the background trying to figure everything out, find the resources, put these pieces together because we acted in crisis. And obviously, I tell people, don't follow my example. But this previous guest was talking about all the data that's out there that you mentioned as well. So not only having to manage the physical or emotional care for someone, but to manage all this data on top of it. If you could talk about that.
Example is okay, so suddenly your mother is in the hospital, you live in Florida, you fly in, where's the information on her electricity bill? Where's the account number? All those little minutia of account information. Where is it? What is it? That's a headache in itself. People don't think about that. They think about the legal documents. That's important right now. I've got another client and we are trying to find her will and to learn whether or not she wants to be resuscitated or be full code or a DNR.
A huge question.
Huge question. And we can't find the documentation on that for her wishes. So right now she's full code, even though she can't respond.
I talk to people about putting this plan together, this horrible four-letter word called plan, before something happens. I'm not sure if you've run into this. Maybe it's my luck, but I've actually worked with clients where they go to me, Dad didn't like banks, and we really believe he put money in the wall. And so, what are you going to do? I mean, are you going to take a hammer and go through every piece of sheetrock in Dad's house looking for money? Because there's been, in the case I was working with, there had been no communication. Dad wound up in a very severe Alzheimer's situation, and you could not have a conversation with him about where the money was. Have you ever run into something like that?
Not quite like that. The biggest challenges I run into, which I'm sure is pretty common, is you get the elderly person and you're now managing their care as a professional, but the family fly in or they're distant and they think they know better what's better for mom and dad and ignore their wishes, sometimes even ignore their legal documentation that says this is what I want. So the children, for lack of a better phrase, they lose their minds when it comes to caring for their parents or not caring for the parents. And sadly, a more frequent thing is they just want their hand out for the money.
Yeah, and that's real, and that's really unfortunate. We actually had a case we were working on where Dad had passed, Mom was still with us. There were three kids. Mom had a severe case of Alzheimer's. At some point, years before, had said to one of the brothers, "Don't ever take me out of the house. I want to stay in the house." And that's what resonated in this gentleman's mind. So they lived in a location where they had a house that was worth quite a bit of money, and they went through almost every penny trying to take care of mom, where it would have been probably half the price if they had put her into a memory community. But and there was arguments on a consistent basis between the siblings about why should mom be home. She doesn't really even know what's happening around her.
No, I've seen that before too. The mother who was, I'm thinking of another client I had years ago. She was wandering away in the middle of the night. She was leaving lit things on the stove, and the children ended up in court fighting each other on what to do about mom.
Wow, I've seen that too. And I talk about the fact, and I think I said it on one of the previous episodes. I mean, I've seen hurt feelings, I've seen families argue, I've seen lawsuits. And I'm not sure if
Mm.
people really understand. This is especially if, there is no plan and you're trying to put that plan together when mom's flat on her back. It's extremely emotional. This is mom, and she's been there for, obviously your whole life, or dad, or whomever it may be, and now trying to figure out, because I don't know what your philosophy is, kind of took me in a different direction. I tell people, I talk about the family conversation and getting people, like you
Yeah,
said a few minutes ago, to talk as early as possible. So I've been asked many times, well, do we have 5, 6, 7 brothers and sisters? Do they all get involved? And I'm not sure if you're going to agree or not. The advice I give people, let's find out who the lead dog is in the family. Let's find out maybe who has the best relationship with mom or dad or grandmother or grandfather, whomever it is. Try to start putting this plan together, and then a huge word, communicate that to other members of the family. Is that something you would agree with?
absolutely. And, Richard, if we look at it, really the responsibility lies with the parents to put that information together and make that plan. And that I always like to say that is the best gift they can give their children, to make that plan so the children aren't fighting over everything once the parents can't take care of themselves mentally and or physically.
I remember vividly, as I said, we took care of our four parents in crisis, but I specifically remember one day sitting in my dad's house when mom and dad lived together, and him looking at me and pointing to a file cabinet across the room and saying that everything you're going to need, all the data we're talking about, I mean, he was this older gentleman, older generation, so everything was still in paper, but everything that we needed was in that file cabinet, kind of that gift to the kids to somewhat make this easier. You talk about sometimes having to be a bridge between the adult children and the loved one that's being taken care of. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Being the older parent, being who's planned everything, being the bridge.
Or you being the bridge. You
Oh
you
yes,
being the
oh
bridge between
yes.
the older loved ones and the adult children.
I have sat in the room with all the children and the parents, usually after meeting with them separately, the parents being my clients and the children being the uh, people who need to be brought in and made to understand what the parents' wishes are and that they are going to benefit them in the long run. Having that conversation is not easy. There's been plenty of times where we've had to all take a breath and leave the room and come back. But it pays off for the parents and the children in the long run to have them understand that this is the parents' life. These are their choices.
We're talking about this difficult subject. We're talking about this four-letter word called plan. We're talking about the fact that people haven't been there, don't understand how challenging, how complex it can get. So let me ask a couple questions. What is I think I read someplace your clients typically run from about 40 to 80. Is that about right?
Yes.
So, and you mentioned hopefully getting the older loved ones, their parents, to possibly be having this conversation with their adult children. One of the things I talk about, just and it's different today than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. These adult children, especially if they happen to be a tiny bit younger, their life is extremely busy. You mentioned taking someone to practice, taking someone to school. There's so many activities that the kids are involved in, which is pulling the adult children in so many different directions. How do we get people, other than a podcast like this and just talking, how do we get people to realize how important it is to plan and get them actually doing it? Do you have any advice along those lines?
I wish I had a silver bullet on that one, Richard. When I first started out, I was spending a lot of money on advertising and talking. to different groups. I've cut way back on the advertising because I found it was a waste of resources. When you're so focused on your life, you're not going to think about that future, which is so far away and such a intangible. One of the more encouraging things that has happened because of the pandemic and people living all over is some of the younger children have started moving to be closer to their parents. At least in this area, Charleston has become a retirement area. So some of the children have moved here. At the same time, some of those same children they can live anywhere in the world and do their job. So the families, because of the pandemic and the people moving all over the place, if the children are moving closer to the parents, that makes it a little easier, assuming they are going to take care of the parents if the parents haven't planned well, which, as we've discussed earlier, is more than likely the case. There's no easy answer on it.
No, and I agree. And that's why, again, I use the word complexity with so much of this. One of the things you've mentioned a few times and just mentioned again, this whole idea, which makes it really complex, really challenging, long distance caregiving. Do you get involved in that? Are you working with the adult children that may be somewhere else in the US or somewhere else around the world?
Well, the easy answer is I have a client in France. I have a client in Belgium. I have a client in England. I have a
Wow.
client in Texas, New Jersey, California, and their parents are here.
Wow.
So I'm, managing their care on behalf of the children.
So how much more complex is that when you're in that situation? And we know what happens all the time. The family has the house they grew up in pick a city, and the kids, for opportunities, jobs, normally move anywhere. And how complex is that when mom or dad is aging and maybe the kids come home for Christmas, go, wow, mom's changed, or dad's calling me by my brother's name, and start realizing that things have changed.
It's actually a little easier than if the family is local. And that is probably because when they're local, even though they hire the professional, they can't let go of control. So it becomes a little tug of war, if you will. But when they're in another city in another time zone, it's actually a little easier to be the professional who makes most of those decisions on behalf of the child who lives somewhere else.
What do you find? I'm not sure if you've had this experience when there's multiple kids and they live in any place in the US or the world, mom and dad are near you, and they're trying to get involved with that word control, and there's four or five of them, the children from those parents. Go ahead.
Yes, I have had that experience. I have a client. One son lives in Texas, one child lives in New Jersey, one in Rhode Island, and another one in New York. And the family member, who's actually a sibling, is here, who's extremely debilitated. And they hired me to manage that care for him and get him into a proper facility that met his medical requirements and budget. It was they did assign one person to be who is a registered nurse, so that person had the medical knowledge, so that person was in charge of that side of it. There was another person who was in charge of the financial side of it. So I worked mainly with two people. Every once in a while, another sibling would jump in. It never got difficult with me from people trying to control the situation, but I could see that there was tension amongst themselves.
And that's extremely interesting. And it sounds like, just from what you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, if there's the need for other professionals in addition to yourself, you're going to make those referrals, recommendations to the family. Am I correct?
Correct. I often view my role as the person who's managing the entire picture for the family on behalf of my client, who is the person who needs the care. So I'm doing the vetting and the hiring of the caregivers, choosing the facility, making sure that the doctor is doing their job, if not finding the right doctor. So managing the entire
The entire
process.
game, even though it's not a game. No, I
No, it's not
totally
game.
get it. Not at all. So let's look at time frame, putting a plan together. Is that something that's going to take a few days, a few weeks, months? I mean, we're talking about the physical care, the emotional care, the data we're talking about. How long a process can that be?
It can be months. If you're just speaking of the legal documents, getting the attorneys, getting the right attorney. If they don't have an attorney local, which is frequent, because so many people are moving here now, and getting those documents together. And when you have other stakeholders, i.e., family members involved, then you've got to get multiple signatures and agreements. So it's months.
There's that word challenging again, and there's that word complex that I use, and it's trying to get a family to understand all these pieces. It just isn't physically taking care of mom. It's all the things that go around that. Let me ask you a question that I run into a lot. I'm not sure if you do, and that's, we'll just call it the family understanding the cost of care.
Very few people understand the cost, and it's expensive. It is extremely expensive. You want to talk about just home care. So you're home, you hire a home care company, and you want to hire the right home care company. And in this area, the average cost starts at $32 an hour with a 4-hour minimum. And that's assuming you're getting the right home care company. Charleston's got over 70 companies. 10 years ago, we had maybe 10. But even in that 70 companies, there's only a half a dozen that are viable. But even they have trouble hiring workers, but that's a whole nother issue. So that's one cost if they're at home. Then if you go into assisted living, for example, in this area, assisted living is about $4,500 a month. And some facilities have levels of care. And then we go to skilled nursing, which of course is your highest level. We're closer to $10,000 a month. Some people have enough insurance to cover some of that. Many people don't. What's interesting to watch is that the insurance, as you probably know, is the medical insurance field is in flux right now. Everything's changing. I see a time when, in the not too distant future, where we'll be able to stay at home and get pretty much the same care we might get at a skilled nursing facility, depending upon the level of medical need, for example.
But it's a complex question, and it's probably one of the biggest things that I see is just thinking we'll bring someone in the home, we'll do this, we'll do that, and it can't be that expensive. And like I know, I mean, all it's going to do is keep going up. And when I talk about other professionals and we kind of talk about how are we going to get this information out, I talk about a lot of people that are professionals don't even realize, they don't think I work in the senior care industry. I'm talking the estate planners, I'm talking the financial planners, I'm talking the religious leaders, whether it's in your church, synagogue, whatever it may be. And the fact we need a multitude of people to really be educating the public about what you and I are talking about, and the need for that plan, the need to start saving early for care. Because I ask all the time, that $4,500 figure is about the average around the country for an assisted living room. I mean, how many people in this country have $4,500 just sitting around to pay month after month after month for a loved one? And we know, I haven't seen the stats recently, but it used to be someone might be in a community like that for 2.5 years, and you can do the math and understand what type of cost we're looking at. So I don't know if you agree with me, but this peripheral of professionals and people, we as a nation really need to start doing a much better job from an education standpoint to get people to understand the challenges you're talking about, the complexities that I'm talking about. What are your thoughts on that?
You couldn't be more right, Richard. I mean, it is so complex, and that might be part of the problem of people, the few people who are even remotely aware of the situation that they need to plan. Maybe it's such a daunting task to learn that they just say, "I'm going to go over here and work on something else in my life." It's it's not getting any easier, and the labor situation has just blown the whole industry up. Here in this area, we get a new facility opening up roughly every 6 months. They're brand spanking new. They look great. They look fantastic. You walk in and say, "Hey, I wouldn't mind living here." But guess what? After 3 months, you got a complete staff turnover. And the home care industry is similar, sadly.
And I was going to agree with you. I mean, that we saw that problem before the pandemic, both from a community standpoint and the home care industry, and it's only gotten worse. And what are we going to do about that, where potentially the home care industry has enough prospects, the families that want care, but they don't have enough caregivers to go out to those homes?
That's correct. That's correct. I don't know if the answer is yet.
Yeah, I think, and what I'm hoping through this podcast to get all this information out, this education, this in conversations with folks like you, and then hopefully start this national conversation. Okay, we have the numbers I use are about 109 million right now per the AARP that are over 50. In 20 some years, that's going to be closer to about 160 million.
Yeah.
And what are we going to do with all those folks? And the fact that the boomer generation that I'm smack in the middle of, it's hard to comprehend. The oldest boomers are going to be 80 in less than 3 years. So, how are we going to address all of this? I have a question for you. I know you provide guardian services as well. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and that's a situation where the elderly person can no longer manage their own affairs mentally and physically, and they're being taken advantage of. Sadly, it's most often people they know. Usually, it's family or a neighbor. So a doctor and the authorities step in, and to protect that person, they assign a guardian. And my role in South Carolina is to manage their health care and where they live. So that's really the short of it. That the need for that is also increasing as we get older.
One of the things I've seen in doing some research on you is what, and we can kind of wrap up with this, what you consider a good plan and what it should cover. And there's four areas: the medical needs, the economic stability, the legal regulations, and individual independence. And some of this we've talked about, but can you talk about that a little more?
Those are the four pieces that are the most important to anyone's plan, to plan with your financial advisor. And some clients have what they call family offices that manage their entire picture. And most people have a financial advisor or a CPA to make sure that all your finances are clear and you're working to pay for your care in the future. And tied really closely to that is the legal piece of it, of course. Let's get your powers of attorney ready. I am POA for 6 people right now. Some of those are healthcare power of attorneys that will, kick in when that person loses capacity. And my job, or anybody's job who is takes on that role, is to execute their wishes as they've written down in their powers of attorney that they've worked out with their attorney. And the medical side is important too, because you want to have that information available so that the people you assign know what your medications are, know who your doctors are, not just your general practitioner, but your oncologist, all the different doctors that we all have as we grow older, and we usually have more of them. So knowing their numbers, your account numbers should be on there as well. And then what's become a more complicated is the personal information that we all have. Since we're all online now, all our passwords, all the information in those different accounts online, who's going to have access to that to be able to close out those accounts when you can no longer use them?
Wow. We talk about challenges, we talk about complex, we talk about fantastic information that you've been giving out. I hope the folks that are listening, understand this and hopefully take a step if you're the adult children to reach out to the older loved one. I've given some advice on how that can happen on previous episodes, or if you're, as you've recommended, you're the older loved one, how you would reach out to your adult children. And as we're talking about, just one of the basic questions as you age, and if something happens to you, where do you want to live? Do you really want to stay at home? Does that make sense? Do you really understand if you think your daughter or son will take care of you? Have you ever talked to them about that? Probably not. And if they can't do this or are unwilling, do you understand what it's going to cost to bring someone in to take care of you, your husband, wife, whatever it may be? So, a lot of great information. Before we head out, if people want to connect with you, what's the best way to do that?
Well, they can go directly to lucasadvisor.com, and that's lucasadvisor.com, and see the information. My contact information is there. I'm also on LinkedIn, where I get involved in conversations about exactly what we're talking about.
That's great. And as we wrap this up, folks, what I always do at this part of our episode is remind you, if you want to send questions, if you want to send comments to me, I'm going to give you an email. Do you have a pen and are you ready? It's eldered23@gmail.com. That's ELDERED 2023@gmail.com. And I really want to say thank you to you. I really appreciate this conversation and all the information that we've talked about. And you have a wonderful day, Luke.
Thank you, Richard. Take care.